All right, now let me go forward. Got a lot to do, and there's more I want to explain about this. First, a side leg. I'm going to give you more profiles of famous economists along the way, and today's profile is on David Ricardo. Now, David Ricardo is well known because he's kind of the founder or the popularizer of the principle of comparative advantage. He first wrote about this in this book called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. It dates to 1817. So we've known about comparative advantage since then. And there's actually a contemporary of David Ricardo, a guy named Robert Torrens, who actually first published an account which was a clear description of comparative advantage. But he never got famous because he didn't write a textbook, what eventually became a textbook used for like 50 years plus in universities and stuff. Ricardo wrote that textbook, and Ricardo became associated then and known as the kind of founder of comparative advantage. Okay, now because of that, when we talk about this model in an international trade class, we call it the Ricardian model. It is the model derived and talked about by Ricardo a time ago. And Ricardo was, for the reasons we're getting from the conclusion of this model, Ricardo was a proponent of freer trade. Okay, so just take note of that. He was in favor of and thought that markets can work for themselves exactly, or at least to some degree, as described in this model of comparative advantage. Okay, but Ricardo did one thing. He changed the model assumptions a little bit to make it a little bit more difficult to imagine that trade would be advantageous. Okay, so let me go back to the assumptions I made about Smith and Jones. I said Smith has an absolute advantage in the production of oranges. And it turns out he also has a comparative advantage in that. In the original formulation, said Jones has an absolute advantage in apples. And it turns out he also has a comparative advantage. So it seems from the numbers we plugged in at first that absolute and comparative advantage are the same thing, but they're not. Remember, comparative advantage is associated with the slope of a person's production possibility frontier, and it corresponds to the opportunity cost of producing a particular good. What Ricardo did in his analysis and presentation of comparative advantage is he considered the following possibility. He said, what if one of the people, or countries in his case, what if one of the people was better at producing both goods, in the sense that they had an absolute advantage in both apples and oranges in our particular model, and the other person wasn't good at producing anything in comparison? You know, what would happen? Would trade between the two individuals be a potentially welfare improving outcome? And what he found was that the answer was yes, but that you can't rely on absolute advantage to drive the result. Instead, you have to focus your attention on comparative advantage. So let me show you what I mean. Here's an example of a diagram, Smith and Jones, and they have a production possibility frontier that's presented to you in front of you, okay? Now, Smith's origin is down here. Jones's origin is up here on the upper right. All right. Smith's production possibility frontier is given by this blue line. And Jones's production possibility frontier is given by this blue line, again, relative to his origin up there on the upper right. Okay, now, these two production possibility frontiers intersect down here in the corner of the Edgeworth box, and that's an indicator to you that that would be a specialization point. That's where they would move in specialization, okay? And that's the diagram that's being depicted here. But from this diagram, I could ask you the following questions, and I will. Listen carefully. I might ask you, given this diagram, and given that Smith and Jones are working, let's say, 1 hour, well, what's Smith's productivity in the production of oranges? Okay, 10. And the answer would also be the units, which would include 10 oranges per hour. So remember to include the units in a full answer, especially on quizzes and exams. Okay, we'll look at the diagram and we'll ask, what is Jones's productivity of oranges? Okay, the answer is, look at Jones's origin here. His orange intercept is right there, which is at 5 units of oranges. So Jones's productivity for oranges is 5 oranges per hour compared to Smith's 10 oranges per hour. So therefore, we could look at that and say, well, Smith has an absolute advantage in the production of oranges because his productivity for oranges is higher. But let's do the same exercise for apples. What is Smith's productivity for apples real quick? Okay, 6 is the popular answer, and that's the correct answer. Look at on his diagram. We're going to look at the intercept where his ppf intercepts the vertical axis. It's at 6. So Smith can produce 6 apples per hour. What is Jones's productivity for apples? 5 is the popular and correct answer. Look at Jones's origin, count out to where it intercepts his apple axis, and it's going to be at 5 apples. So because 6 orange apples per hour for Smith is greater than 5 apples per hour for Jones, Smith also has the absolute advantage in the production of apples. So Smith is better at producing both goods. But then we could ask, well, who has the comparative advantage in the production of these goods? And to do that, we have to calculate the opportunity cost. So here's a question. What is the opportunity cost of oranges for Smith? Remember that it's the slope of his production possibility frontier, with oranges listed on the horizontal axis. So if we're to calculate the slope, all we have to do is look at the rise, this distance here, divided by the run, which is this distance here. It's going to be equal to 6 over 10, which is equal to 3 over 5, and that's going to be in units of apples per orange. So that's his opportunity cost. That's an S up here, by the way, not a J. Okay, well, let's ask the question. What is the opportunity cost of Jones in oranges? And that's going to be the slope of his production possibility frontier. A bunch of correct answers are coming up, and indeed it is 5 divided by 5, which is 1 apple per orange. And if we calculate this, compare them to each other, we say 3/5 is clearly less than 1, and so therefore Smith produces oranges lower opportunity cost than Jones, and therefore Smith has a comparative advantage in the production of oranges. But if we did the reverse, if we said, well, what is the opportunity cost of Smith in apples? That's going to be equal to the reciprocal of the number up above, and it's going to correspond to 5/3 oranges per apple. And if we calculate Jones's opportunity cost for apples, that's going to be equal to 5 over 5, which is 1 orange per apple. Doing this quickly to move on, and that means that 1 is less than 5/3, so therefore Jones here has the comparative advantage in the production of apples. Even though Jones is worse at producing both goods, it turns out he still has a comparative advantage in something. And that opens up the possibility for mutually advantageous trade to take place between the two. And this diagram demonstrates exactly how it might arise. All right, so let's say they have these particular productivities, they come together in the market, they decide that they're going to trade with each other, and they specialize in the production of their comparative advantage good, which would be Smith in oranges, Jones in apples. They produce 10 oranges and 5 apples respectively. And then given the diagram, we can see that there is a potential for them to trade in between their PPFs to a point that's listed there, where the two difference curves I've drawn look like they're tangent to each other, right? A Pareto optimal point. They could trade up to that particular point, and if they did, they're both going to get to a point that's higher than their original production possibilities, and therefore higher in overall utility than they obtained before. All right, so what this example shows is not that it has to arise this way, but that it can. That specialization in the comparative advantage good turns out to be what's relevant, and that too can lead to a situation where specialization and trade makes even the worst producer, Jones, better off as a result of a particular outcome. All right, and that was surprising in Ricardo's time and continues to be counterintuitive and difficult to understand for a lot of folks today. To put this in just one broader context, if we imagine that Smith is a country, Smith country, and we imagine that Jones is another country, Jones country, we might ask the question, well, what if, you've got a little developing country that's not very good at producing everything. They don't have the best technology or the greatest technology. They're using a lot of more primitive or simpler production methods. How could they possibly compete with a United States or a European Union where the production methods are technologically more advanced? And one might conclude intuitively that there's no basis for gains from trade, that that the poorer country is just going to be left out of the mix, and maybe the trade is going to be disadvantageous for them, so they might not even want to trade. Intuition might lead you that way. But what the Ricardian model, Ricardo's conclusion is that it doesn't necessarily lead to that conclusion, that the developing country can still gain advantages. They can become better off than they would have been, that would have been possible, by specializing in their comparative advantage, the goods they produce relatively best, and then trading that with the more developed countries in the world. Okay, again, first pass at this particular principle or concept doesn't seem like intuitively that should be the result, but it's what Ricardo demonstrated empirically and what we've been teaching in economics classes for over 2 centuries now. And it is something that I think holds up to scrutiny. And, if you go back and think about, well, what did Adam Smith say was an important component of the wealth of nations? And he said the division of labor. Dividing up labor into specialties and reorganizing production is really specializing in the goods in which you have a comparative advantage in, producing the things which you're relatively best at. And if everybody in the world did that, we would be able to increase the total amount of output that we get with the limited resources that we have available. So, one thing, and I would highlight that if you're concerned about, for example, environmental issues and thinking we should readjust our production process in order to take that further into account, well, one thing that we ought to be aware of is that what the principle of comparative advantage says is that by rearranging production, we can actually get more output with fewer resources. And one of those resources in a more complex world is energy. So if you want to get more output with fewer resources, fewer energy inputs, you're going to want to think about how can we adjust production in a way that would help correspond or would correspond to comparative advantage, because that's going to get you the best kind of bang for the buck, if you will, more output with more limited amounts of resources. So giving up comparative advantage, saying, oh, to protect the environment, we're going to separate and stop globalizing, and we're going to concentrate our production locally instead of internationally. What our model suggests is that that's actually going to tend to have the effect of raising the amount of overall resources you use on a global scale in order to produce what might turn out to be a smaller amount of goods and services as a result. Again, first pass, that might seem counterintuitive to most of you, but it's the result we are driven to by carefully examining these conditions in a much more simpler version of the world, which is what we're doing with these dual models. And so, while I wouldn't tell you, okay, this is a solid conclusion and you should just accept it, it should give you pause about kind of concluding the non-intuitive results that people are still clinging to sometimes because they haven't been presented with or learned the principle of comparative advantage that's illustrated here. Okay, so this is a really powerful and important principle in economics. Again, it only arises under certain conditions. It's not necessarily generally true across the board, but it is indicative of a lot of things that we do see happen in the real world, and it's important to understand these particular principles. So on this particular question, what do the black dots represent? What I meant here to represent is what they may well have produced if they were in autarky. So if they were not specializing, Smith likely to have produced here, Jones is likely to have produced at a point like that. And by virtue of specialization in the corner point and trade here, they're actually going to be able to get to a point that's higher, more apples and more oranges than they were achieving when they were in autarky or producing for themselves. And that's an illustration just of how it's possible for the specialization in trade to make both of them better off as a result of that trade. All right, so now I'm going to take this idea of producing apples and oranges, and we're going to use it to illustrate a couple of other important economic principles. And in particular, we want to work our way towards the sources of economic growth. Sort of at a fundamental level, what causes economies to grow bigger? And comparative advantage is going to be an important component of that, though not the only one. Okay, the way we're going to do that, let me just make sure that everyone, you're not seeing the new Yes. Okay, we're gonna set up a model with a new set of assumptions, and we're gonna take a different tack, if you will. We're gonna present this in a slightly different way. Okay, so here's the model assumptions. We're going to suppose that there are three sisters, and we're going to call the sisters Olga, Maria, and Irina, it should be. And I drew the names of the sisters. If you type into Google Three Sisters, you should quickly come up with the Anton Chekhov play titled Three Sisters. And the three sisters in that particular play are Olga, Maria, and Irina. So that's where Irina. So that should be the names of the individuals. Each sister, we're going to imagine, can work to produce apples or oranges, but they have different productivities with respect to each of the goods. Okay, the sisters desire to produce as many apples and oranges as they can between them. They're interested in maximizing their production because that will maximize their consumption. We're thinking of them working in a single household, and so they're sharing these individual goods. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put together a three-person production possibility frontier. And if we just look at this diagram real quick, I've got a bunch of little triangles represented here. And each triangle has a name inside of it that corresponds to the individual sister. So let's take Maria, whose PPF is positioned right here nicely on the origin. We're going to imagine that Maria can produce this many oranges in an hour. If she produced all of her time, we're going to say a day of work is involved here. So one day of work is going to allow Maria to produce 15 oranges, or alternatively 15 apples, or some combination thereof, which is the PPF drawn between those particular endpoints. Now, Olga here, we're going to imagine has a PPF that looks like this. And imagine this were the origin 0, then Olga is imagined to be able to produce 25 oranges in an hour, or 10 apples in an hour, or some combination between the two. And Irina, well, she can produce either 10 oranges per hour, 25 apples per hour, or some combination between the two. So we might ask, well, who should produce what, and how would we make a decision about that particular? How would we organize or arrange production? And the answer for us is, as economists, is to try to construct the production possibility frontier, where frontier means kind of how do we get as far out to the right, upper right as possible, recognizing that more is better, because that's one of the fundamental assumptions about preferences for the individuals and the household. You know, we want to figure out how do we get as far to the upper right as we can in this particular diagram. Now, I've organized these particular little triangles on the left-hand side here in a way that, suppose we start out by imagining Maria, Olga, and Irina all produce only apples. Okay, so they all devote their attention to just apples. Then Maria, listed here, is going to be able to produce 15 of those apples. Olga is going to add on another 10, and Irina is going to add on 25 of those apples for a total of 50 apples. So if they all produce nothing but apples, the grand total amount they would produce is 50. All right, and that's the maximum number of apples they could conceivably get. All right, well now, starting from that particular starting point, we might ask, well, what if we moved one of the sisters into orange production? And just because it's listed up here, let's imagine that the sister we move happens to be Irina. All right, now Irina, if we move production for her into orange production, then we're going to move down along this particular production possibility frontier for Irina. I don't know if you can see my little cursor there. And we're going to end up at the maximum. If we put all of Irina's effort into orange production, at most she can produce 10 oranges. Okay, but that's not really going to be the best way in which we can move production into oranges. If we think, well, Irina has to give up a lot of apples in order to produce more oranges. Is there a better way to do it? And the answer is yes. Let's move Olga up to the top instead, and imagine that we let Olga produce oranges first. Okay, so we're going to move Irina down just a little bit. Now we're going to move Olga over there. And Olga is on the top, and then we move Olga into the production of oranges. Then notice that she gives up fewer apples to produce an additional orange. And so we're going to be giving up fewer of one good to get more of the other. It's the best for us to move Olga into the production of oranges first. And then we could move Irina's, if she produced only apples, we would end up over there. And if Maria produced only apples, we'd end up there. And so we could end up at this point up here. producing 25 oranges and 40 apples in total if we let Irina and Maria specialize in apples and we let Olga specialize in oranges. Okay, well, next, who should we move over into production of oranges next? Well, the answer to that is not Irina. Maria is actually going to be next best in producing oranges. So we're going to move her there. And then Irina is going to be the last person we'd want to move into orange production. And we're going to move her down over like this. Okay, by doing that, we're going to get a production possibility frontier that's furthest up and to the right. The frontier will be further out, as far out as possible. And that's going to define what we call the efficient frontier for this particular three-household economy. And this is what the three-person PPF would look like then. Now one thing that that we should note about this is that we're actually ordering production. If we ask, well, who should be moved into production of oranges first, the answer is Olga. And if we were to calculate Olga's opportunity cost of oranges, it would be equal to the slope of her PPF, which is equal to 10 divided by 25. Okay, and that would be in apples per orange. If we calculated Maria's opportunity cost, this is Olga, this is Maria, and of oranges, hers is going to be 1 apple per orange. It's the slope of PPF here. And if we calculated the opportunity cost for Irina for oranges, that's going to be equal to 25 divided by 10, or 2.5. And notice that Olga's opportunity cost is the least, and Irina's opportunity cost is the most. So what we want to do in organizing production is we want to move individuals into the production of a good. We want to move the person who has the lowest opportunity cost of producing oranges into producing oranges first, because she's the one who will have to give up fewer apples in order to produce more oranges. And in order to achieve the most efficient, the best outcome in terms of production, Olga would be the person we want to have produce oranges first, Maria second most, and then Irina third most if there's a strong demand for oranges. Okay, but that's going to give us the production possibility frontier that is best. And it means, bullet point down on the bottom, that we're producing on the basis of comparative advantage. That's what it means. Now, we can use this diagram to talk about a couple of important economic concepts. The first, we want to talk about inefficient production. If Maria and Olga and Irina produced at a point in the interior of their production, inside of their PPF, we're going to call that particular point inefficient. And that's going to be true of every point that's not on the frontier. If you're on the frontier, like this point here, we're going to call that point efficient in production. And that means you're using your resources to the best possible, in the best possible way. You're getting furthest out on your production possibility. You're getting to the frontier. So being on the frontier, on this entire line right here, anywhere in production there is going to be called efficient production. Anything inside of it is going to be called inefficient production. So that's how we distinguish between the two. Now, feasible production. Feasible means they can do it. So they can produce at this point, or at this point, or at this point, or at this point. All of these points are feasible, possible to produce. The infeasible points are the ones out here, beyond the production possibility frontier. They can't produce more than the resources they have available to get them somewhere. Okay, and they simply cannot produce out there. So those would be called infeasible production points. Feasible is inside and include boundary. Efficient is just breaking up the production possibility set, which includes both the frontier, which is the efficient points, and inside of the frontier, which are the inefficient but feasible production points. All right, so that's just some terminology that you should know. First, how would Maria and Olga and Irina as a household decide how much to produce and what the best production point for them would be? Well, to answer that question, we're going to put together what we might call the supply side of the model with the demand side of the model. Preferences correspond to demand. Supply, production possibilities correspond to supply. And so if we want to ask the question, how will we decide how much Olga and Maria and Irina will consume and demand? First of all, we've got to figure out what their possible supply levels are. That's given by the production possibility frontier. And then second, we have to superimpose on top of that their preferences. And we can represent their preferences with indifference curves in this particular diagram. All right, now I'm presenting to you indifference curves that cross each other. And you should know that an indifference curve, same individual or household with the same preferences can't cross each other. So what I'm representing here are two different types of preferences, meaning listed here, I1 preferences, those corresponding to this particular indifference curve and the others that correspond to it. There are a lot of other ones that we could draw, of course. Those preferences have a stronger desire for oranges than do the I2 preferences, and we can know that because their optimal point here at A will give the household more oranges and fewer apples. And so it sort of tilts their preferences in the direction of more oranges. They like oranges better. Whereas if their preferences for the household were I2, they would like oranges a little bit less. But the point that I'm trying to make with this diagram is that the exercise economists would imagine is that regardless of whether they have I1 or I2 preferences, they're going to push these indifference curves out as far as they can go until we find a tangency point, like at A. Or we intersect a particular corner of the PPF, such as B. And then that means there's no way we can get to a higher level of preference or utility for the individual household. And anything less, like at this point or this point, is going to put them on a lower indifference curve, not going to be the optimal. So point B would correspond to one version of the best outcome for the household. A would be under a different set of preferences. But notice that one outcome we're going to get here is that consumption should end up on the efficient frontier. It should be on the PPF itself, because that's going to be using their resources to the best possible way. Now, the last thing we might look at with this diagram, I don't know if I've got this on the next slide or not, yeah, is that at every particular point on this diagram, you should be able to identify who's producing how much of what. So if we're producing at point B, well, that means that Olga is producing all of the oranges, and Maria and Irina are producing nothing but apples. If we were to produce at this point, call it C, well, then Olga and Maria would be producing all of the oranges, and Irina would be producing but apples. If we were producing at this point here, let's call it D, then again, Olga and Maria are producing all of the oranges, and Irina is producing a few more of the oranges. But then Irina is producing all of the apples, this distance. So Irina is producing this many oranges and that many apples at point D. And that's how we're getting there. If we produced at this point up here, call it E, well, in order to get up there, Maria and Irina have to be producing apples, and Olga has to be producing some apples as well. So Olga is diversifying, we would say, producing a little bit of oranges and apples, while Maria and Irina at point E are producing nothing but apples. All right, so that's how we can identify who produces what, depending on which point they would choose is their maximum, according to their preferences. Now, what do we do with this diagram? First, we use it to define some economic principles or concepts. We've done that. We've identified the importance of comparative advantage in deciding how to order or arrange production between a group of individuals. Okay. Here's an example, and what I'm doing in this diagram is suggesting what would happen if we organize production incorrectly. What if, and I'm imagining this situation, suppose Irina insists on being the first to produce oranges. She just says, I really hate collecting apples and I just want to produce oranges. And maybe she's the oldest of the group and she says, I get to do what I want to do. And so therefore Irina produces the oranges. But Irina's not very good at producing oranges. So if she produced the first oranges for the group, then they'd move down their PPF, not quite the right specification now. Their kind of PPF under these assumptions would be at this point right here. And then if Maria moved into orange production next, they'd move down along here. And if Olga were the last one to move into orange production, they would move down along this. So we would end up with a quote unquote frontier. And I'm putting that in quotes because it's not really the frontier. This would be a bad way of organizing production, and because it would lead to inefficient production at a point like C. But notice that if Irina produces the oranges, and Olga produces the apples, and Maria produces a little bit in between, which is okay, they're all going to be working their full day. They're all using all of their effort to produce goods and services, but they're producing way inside the efficient frontier. They're not organizing production in the best way. And this is like I was saying before, if you want to get the biggest output possible from a collection of resources on this planet, you want to allow production to take place on the basis of comparative advantage, because that's going to be the most efficient use of the resources. You're going to take all those inputs, Irina, Maria, and Olga, you're going to arrange them in production appropriately, and you're going to be able to produce at a point like A rather than at a point like C where you messed up in terms of who was producing what. Now, we might end up at a point like C if production is not based on profit seeking. Because if production was organized, and let's say based on dictates from the government, then the government might have different desires and say, well, we just think Irina, she's the oldest, we're going to put her in production of oranges first. We're going to organize it and we're going to let Maria go. So if you're told what to produce, but you're not doing it on the basis of what's in your own best interests, that's the kind of thing that can lead to inefficient outcomes. But if you turn it around, again, in the context of the simple model, and let Maria and Olga and Irina kind of do what's in their own individual best interests, then they should be guided, as if by an invisible hand, to produce the goods on the basis of comparative advantage. And that would actually maximize their utility, quote unquote, profits that they might earn in the production process here itself. And this is, again, giving us more indicators that profit seeking under the right conditions can actually lead to better outcomes for the economy overall. We can become richer, have more goods with the limited resources we have if we follow the principle of comparative advantage in production. And that, at least at a glance, can be realized through profit seeking. If individual businesses are seeking profits, again, and they're doing and maintaining the ethical constraints we highlighted before, then we can get these better outcomes for an economy overall. Okay, next thing. Let's just for a moment imagine, and this is going to be basically for anyone who has taken an economics class, especially a macroeconomics class. You may have seen a PPF that looks like this. Production possibility frontier that's bowed out, it's curved rather than straight lines. The PPF we're looking at here, straight lines, right? And that's because of the simplistic assumptions we're making about production for Olga and Maria. But suppose we imagine there wasn't just 3 individuals producing. Let's suppose there's thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals producing apples and oranges. And let's say they all have different opportunity costs of producing oranges. So they all have a different slope to their tiny little production possibility frontier, which gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we get to millions of people producing in this particular economy. Okay, well, if we had lots of different people and they all had different characteristics in production, some were really, really good at producing oranges, not very good at apples, some the reverse, how would we realize the efficient and get to the efficient frontier? How would we figure out what the PPF looked like? And the answer is we would organize production, again, on the basis of comparative advantage, moving the resources at first into the production process, those that have the lowest opportunity cost for oranges. And the people we would move last into the production of oranges is going to be the people who are very good at producing apples. These people that have a much steeper slope to their production possibility frontier. So you can imagine we start ordering different PPFs here, and we keep moving all these individuals, and we're ordering them in the basis of comparative advantage again. And that's going to allow us to get out to the most efficient frontier. Now, I just want to do this to raise the point that sometimes this is a term that's sometimes thrown out in economics. We sometimes describe this kind of a PPF as an increasing cost PPF. That as you move to the right along this diagram, costs are increasing. Well, what costs are we talking about? The costs we're increasing are opportunity costs. Opportunity costs start out really low for the first person added to orange production. They end up really, really high for the last person added to orange production. And I want you to think about this in a more general context for a minute. Suppose it's not just apples, it's not just individuals, people, workers that are used in production. But suppose you also have machinery and equipment and you've got land and you need more stuff to go into the production process. Well, again, what this exercise is illustrating to us is that the way we want to organize production is we want to put the resources who are best suited to producing certain things into the production of those goods first. So, if you've got equipment that's designed for winemaking, or let's do orange and apples. Let's say you've got equipment that's useful for orange production. You're going to want to use that equipment in orange production first. And you're going to want to use the people that have the most knowledge about orange production first. You want to move those into orange production initially because they're going to be best suited to produce oranges at lowest cost. And the people will move into orange production. Let's say we've got preferences that are just, people really hate apples, but they love oranges. And this is their indifference curves over here, just tangent at this point. Well, that means we're going to have to move almost everybody over into orange production. Even those that aren't that good at orange production, we're going to move them over. But the people we leave in apple production are going to be those here who are really good at apple production. And they're going to be the ones who should be producing apples. So again, it just kind of gives us some ability to kind of think about how we would organize and arrange production if we've got resources, inputs, that have different productivities, different capabilities in producing different goods. And Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage turns out to be the key. That's going to allow us to establish and realize the most efficient frontier on a production possibility frontier. Okay, I got about 10 minutes left, and that's going to give me just enough time to talk about the key aspect of why I'm constructing this PPF. I want to talk about the sources of economic growth. And there's 4 of them, fundamental sources, okay? And any other source you might come across is probably going to be some variation on the ones that I'm describing here. And fundamentally, a lot of times, you're going to get into a macro course, for example, and they're going to say, well, how do we grow the economy? And somebody might say, we increase the money supply. We can increase the money supply, and that's going to cause the economy to grow. And that might be true. But fundamentally, in the background, growth is going to have to come about for one of the reasons that I'm describing here. So maybe increasing the money supply can induce some other changes, but it's going to ultimately have to cause some of the changes that I'm describing here. Fundamentally, these are the reasons growth in an economy occur. Okay, and why do we care about growth? Again, we care because presumably we recognize that goods and services lead to a utility or happiness for individuals. And we'd like to get as much stuff out there to as many people as possible to try to increase the total amount of happiness that's accruing to individuals. We want to raise up people's standards of living if we possibly can. And if we're not satisfied with we don't have to grow. If we're satisfied with our standard of living and we don't really need to improve the well-being of anyone in the economy, there's no economic necessity for growth. But there is if you want to increase the standards of living, especially of those who are not doing as well. Then growth is going to be at least one way to do that. There's problems, remember, and that has to do with whether the growth accrues to the poorer people or whether it accrues to the richer people. Not going to get into that issue right now. It's a relevant one. We're going to come back to that, and we're going to think about those problems associated with growth a little bit later. Okay, so let's get to the fundamentals. First reason for economic growth, increase in resources. And by that I mean, in this context, more people. If you add more people to producing apples and oranges, guess what? You're going to be able to produce more apples and oranges. Okay, so let's suppose, first of all, that we only have Olga and Irina producing. If that's true, then the PPF is going to move Olga into production of oranges first and Irina second. And so the PPF for a two-person economy, Olga and Irina, is going to be right there. Okay, but let's say now we add Maria into the mix and we continue to produce on the basis of comparative advantage. Well, adding Maria into the mix will shift the production possibility frontier outward everywhere. And notice, if you only like apples, you're still going to get more apples. If you only like to consume oranges, you're still going to get more oranges. If you like to produce a little bit of both, you're still going to be able to get a little bit of both. So the entire production efficient frontier shifts outward, and it comes about because we've added Maria into the mix. So that's the first source of economic growth. If we add more labor or workers, we add more capital equipment more generally, more equipment, more machinery. Those additions should enable an economy to produce more goods and services overall. Okay, that's pretty straightforward and should be obvious. The next one is kind of the same idea, but I just want to emphasize it. We could say it's not really a separate category, but sometimes individuals get unemployed. They lose their jobs. And for a period of time, months or sometimes longer, individuals can't, they're trying to get a job, but no one will hire them. There's no jobs available. When individuals are not available to produce, it's kind of like, suppose Maria is unemployed. She can't work. Well, then the PPF is going to shift in for the working individuals to where Olga and Irina are the only ones producing. But if we can take Maria out of the unemployed, if we can put her back to work, then we're going to be able to shift from a point like A up to a point like B by adding Maria to the mix. Now, technically speaking, I should point out that if Maria is not working and we have unemployment and we end up producing at a point like A, we would usually say that the efficient frontier is defined as that with full employment of resources. So we'd always say that the efficient frontier is when all the resources are working, which means that if we move to a point like A because Maria was unemployed, we wouldn't really be moving to a lower efficient frontier. We'd be moving inside the efficient frontier to an inefficient production point. And then moving from A to B is just moving from the interior of the PPF to the PPF itself. And that's what reemployment of unemployed resources would mean. The previous story, where Maria comes into the workfold, might be a better story of Maria was a youth beforehand, wasn't a part of the workforce. And then when she gets to working age, she gets moved into the workforce, and therefore the production possibility frontier actually does shift outward. Okay, so there's some different ways of talking about this, and you'll see it a little bit, you'll see it the latter way more likely in an economics classroom or context. Next source of economic growth real quick is an improvement in productivity or a technology improvement. Okay, and that would come about if Olga, let's say, and Irina are the only two producing, but suppose Olga's efficiency, productivity in oranges rises from 25 oranges per hour to 35 oranges per hour. And let's say Irina's increases from 25 to 35 oranges per hour. Well, if that's true, the entire PPF is going to shift outward from this interior one to this outer one. And that's going to be driven entirely by the increase in productivity, a technology improvement, if you will, for the two individuals producing their comparative advantage goods. Okay, and that's another reason, another way in which growth can occur in an economy. We can add to the technology or the capabilities of production. And that's an important source of growth in an economic system. Now, the last one. The last source of economic growth is rearrangement of production on the basis of comparative advantage. And this too is sort of falls into the unemployed resources. If Irina and Maria and Olga are just not producing effectively because they're not organizing production correctly, this is not really characterized as a PPF because that's not the most efficient frontier that you could achieve. They're producing in the wrong way. So if they reorganize production and let Olga switch over and become the orange producer and Irina switch over and become the last orange producer, the apple producer, then we actually be able to move from point C up to point A and get to the efficient frontier. So rearranging a production on the basis of comparative advantage is like eliminating inefficiencies that are conceivably in an economy by reorganizing production appropriately. And that's similar to the improvement in outcome that can come about from re-employing resources. That too is moving you from an inefficient point to an efficient point on the frontier. That means the only way really to get the frontier to move outward is going to be to increase total resources or increase productivity of those individual resources. And that could lead to a real advance of the frontier.